Welcome to Voices,
a podcast from the Institute for Human Rights and Business.
Here we're seeking to elevate the range of perspectives
on the role of business in the world
and in people's everyday lives.
Hello everyone, I'm Neil Wilkins and I lead the IHRB Migrant Workers Programme. I'm here today with Rosey Hurst, the Chief Executive of award-winning consultancy Impactt. Impactt were founded in 1997 and they specialise in ethical trade, human rights, labour standards and international development. They work with organisations to improve working conditions and livelihoods across global supply chains, and they're very well known for their work, particularly in the Gulf, but also in supply chains in Southeast Asia. Today, we're going to discuss an issue around which we're seeing increased focus and we would hope action: the common practice of migrant workers paying large recruitment fees, costs and charges to secure employment abroad, often to end up working in the supply chains or service industries connected to global brands. We and many other organisations are working to promote a different model of recruitment based on the employer pays principle, that no worker should pay for a job and the cost of recruitment should be borne not by the worker, but by the employer. Rosey, welcome.
Thanks very much, Neil. And it's great to be here. I think this is a very, very burning issue at the moment. And there's been a lot of excellent work done in terms of trying to improve the recruitment and employment process. But we are left at the moment with millions of workers who, of course, have paid recruitment fees.
And there seems to be little access of remedy for these workers. We see companies say that this is an integral part of their efforts to protect migrant workers and prevent exploitation, including forced labour and trafficking. But we still see that many of these workers are paying large sums to secure employment abroad. And even when this is brought to a company's attention, there seems to be little access to remedy for these workers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've been working on this issue in the field on repayment for probably about 5 years now. And we've been able to work on 206 cases, which have involved the repayment of over $100 million to 75,000 workers. Now, that sounds like loads, but it is a microcosm of what's out there. And I think, whilst the forward-looking efforts of companies to improve recruitment channels, companies and organisations to improve recruitment channels are incredibly laudable, unfortunately, the sad fact remains that there are so many workers who have paid life-changing sums of money for jobs which haven't delivered for them. And, why is this important? It's important from a justice point of view, but also we have to remember the UNGP, so the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which require that the victims of human rights abuses have access to effective remedy. And effective remedy means that those people themselves should feel that it's better now. So putting right harms caused to people, including financial harms, as part, and of course these people have suffered these harms as part of their recruitment process.
And I know that your own work organisation has done an awful lot of work on this, but tell me, why is it that you think more focus on repayment will drive change in company business practices around recruitment?
Yeah, it's very interesting this. As I mentioned, a lot of focus has been forward-looking to trying to make it right in the future, and not a lot has been backward-looking. And there has been the fear amongst some that a focus on repayment would simply drive more fees and more repayment in a kind of endless cycle of feeding the beast. Now, our fieldwork does not bear this out. What we see is that the workers who have paid fees, that harm is the biggest harm really that many of them face. And what we see is with the repayment of fees, as far as those workers are concerned, the repayment of, say, $5,000 to a Bangladeshi worker who's paid $5,000 to get their job makes the difference between their migration having been worthwhile or not. It means that they can buy the plot of land when they go home in order to provide for their family in the future. So there's a very, very strong human requirement, I think, a moral case to pay back fees. But it's actually not only that. I think that it's a super strong business case. We find that those companies, those employers which have put in place zero cost recruitment schemes, in many cases, when we go and do field work with them, we find that workers along the line, somewhere, somehow, are still paying fees. So even those recruited under zero cost, sometimes the fees are less, sometimes the fees are the same, and I'm a regret to say sometimes the fees are more, and always the threats and intimidation which workers face to keep quiet about having paid fees has actually got worse. But what we do see is when an employer has had to make a repayment, and these repayment numbers are quite big, that provides quite a shock to the company. And it means that in the future, they try an awful lot harder to have proper oversight over recruitment. So we see the amount of fees paid by workers post-repayment going down by 60 or 70%. So not down to zero, unfortunately, but it seems to be a lot better. And it's simply because more resource, more effort, more concentration is now put on the recruitment because they don't want to have to pay all that money again.
So an important company learning
Yes.
curve on this. So today, in your experience, how common do you think repayment of recruitment fees by companies to workers is, and what has been the challenges faced by those who've attempted to do so?
Well, as I said, it's not nearly common enough. I mean, it tends to happen when there is tremendous international pressure, or when there is the threat of exposure, or latterly, when there is threat of, for example, a ban by US Customs and Border Protection on importing into the United States on the grounds of forced labour. Under those circumstances, we find repayment of fees, that there is a demand to do that, because in those cases, repaying fees gets a company out of trouble. But I think the issue to date has been, and as I said, we've worked on 206 cases, that because there are no standards in this area, each time is like the first time. So each time you have to start from first principles on how much should be paid to whom, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And also, of course, it's a negotiation. So if there isn't enough leverage, then what happens is a partial repayment or a token repayment, which doesn't really address the harm. Neither does it provide the stimulus for doing it better in the future.
So your starting point really then was to see if you could come up with a set of principles that companies could apply to the process of reimbursement. Once they've decided to reimburse, how do they go about it? Now, I know that you sort of undertook quite a significant consultation exercise as you tried to develop these. I know that my organisation, IHRB, were part of that, but perhaps you could just describe that consultation and the things that you found.
Yes, so no, it's been a very long journey. So we first drafted these on the basis of our own experience, which got us a certain distance. And I think that helps with the things that commonly go wrong. You know, we were able to, from our own experience, to provide advice in the standards on those areas. But I think the most important thing has been the consultation. We've had, I think we're in the third round now. The first round was very much technical, talking to lawyers and activists of the standards. But then I think that the bulk of the consultation has been with international bodies, ILO, IOM, governments as well, government procurement agencies, as well as government enforcement agencies and government policymakers. From the private sector, obviously, we've spoken to a lot of companies at different parts of the supply chain, as well as some of the key groups of companies. And of course, IHRB have been fantastic in really facilitating that consultation and bringing people around the table. Of course, it's very important as well to consult with representatives of migrant workers, with trade unions, and we're also now talking with actually, it's now probably more than 100 people have now made comments on the thing. So I think it is achieving a certain balance between what the different stakeholders want, because of course there are different pressures from different stakeholders on where to set the standards. But I sense that we're coming down to something which is fairly well agreed now.
Great to see that level of engagement, definitely. So, Rosey, you're proposing 8 standards that companies committing to a sort of reimbursement process should follow, all of which have a set of sort of due diligence steps and actions. I think that we should just go through the 8 standards, and perhaps just briefly, because some of them are involved, but you can maybe explain why they're important and what are the key challenges in their implementation.
Absolutely. And as I say, the kind of definition of these standard areas came out of lived experience. So these are the areas which either appear far from obvious, difficult, controversial. And what we try to do in these standards is signpost a way through each of these. So for some of the standards, we have a minimum standard, middle ground, and a best practice. For others, we don't have those different things, because of course we're talking about people implementing the standard who have different levers and different stakes. So I think it's important to make sure that we capture that in the standard. So the first standard is scope for repayment, which is basically who gets the money, who is in and who is out. Now, this is often extremely controversial, and before the standards often had to be established through first principles. Obviously, the goal is that all migrant workers that paid fees and costs are reimbursed. As an absolute minimum, we suggest counting in all migrant workers who were employed on the date of the most recent investigation. Now, that standard sets the bottom marker for that. The top marker, of course, is all current and former migrant workers should be in scope for repayment. And actually, we have several repayments ongoing where it's proving actually remarkably easy to get hold of workers who have left. So as I say, these things are practical, so there's nothing suggested here which we have found to be impossible. So that's the scope, who's in. The second part is, of course, working out how much, because we know there are no receipts. So what we need to do is propose a way of finding out what is the quantum that each person has paid, according to paid to a large number of different actors. Of course, it's not just one lump sum. They've paid all the way along the line. So we talk about how an investigation should be carried out, what the sample size should be, in order to get a proper data set for the organisation. And again, we have a minimum standard and a best practice on that. Then the number 3 is how much. So you've worked out from a sample which types of people have paid what. We recommend at minimum standard calculating a repayment using an average for each nationality, factoring in interest and exchange rate. And then towards the best practice end, we also factor in inflation and lost opportunity cost. And there's quite a lot of detail. That's possibly the most detailed part of the standard. So those of you interested in sums, you can have a look at how to calculate them. And we will be producing a ready reckoner, which will help companies, I think, to establish their liability here. Then there's the timeline. The goal is to get the money back to the workers as quickly as possible, because of course, stretching the thing out means possibly that people are being kept in bonded labour, and the fact that they're waiting for these repayments may indeed actually act as a bond on them. So minimum standard, we say all repayments within 6 months. Best practice, all repayments in a lump sum, but together with a bit of education about how not to be duped out of your windfall as well. So it's important to make sure that workers are prepared at this.
No, absolutely, can see that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Number 5 is including locally recruited migrant workers. So these would be people who have not come to an employer directly from overseas, but who have come over from another employer. So they will have paid fees some time back in order to get their first entry to the country. So we suggest at a minimum a goodwill payment towards their fees and costs, and as best practice that they should also be included in the scope.
So that would stop companies poaching
Yes.
workers from others. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think what we want to try to develop is a healthy local recruitment market, which doesn't undercut. So again, playing with the market a little bit here, I think is important, as well as making sure that that even these workers in this slightly more complicated state are getting some benefit. Now, the last 3 points I think are super crucial. So we move slightly away from the technical towards points which are crucial to the success or failure indeed of any repayment. The first one of this, number 6, is communication with migrant workers. It's very important that workers are engaged all along the process and understand why they're being asked the questions and what is happening. This is important obviously for rights-based reasons. It's also important in order to get the truth and to get the full picture. But it's also very important for ensuring success, because only workers who understand what is going on when they receive money back feel a true benefit. We find that if it's just a gift from the gods, it doesn't actually result in people feeling better about themselves. So we need to, we only set one standard here. There's no need for minimum or maximum. It's just, we clearly set out here how to engage with workers throughout the process. Point number 7, verification. Super important, of course, to check that the payments have actually been made, that nothing's gone astray, whether from an administrative error or from something more sinister. And of course, that's super important. And finally, and most important of all, is safeguarding workers all the way along the process. And we have to remember, of course, that when you're talking about passing money to workers who are very exploitable and who have been milked in order to get their job, there is a big danger that they may also be milked again for this money. So guarding all the way along the line. And then we've got a number of hints and tips about how best to do that.
I think those safeguards for workers within this process, we must never forget the potential vulnerabilities of workers at all stages. And it'll be bad enough it's bad enough when you're paying large fees, but then to be duped out of your repayment in some way would add insult to injury, clearly.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So Rosey, those are the standards, and have you applied these in a real life setting? I know that you've done a lot of work in the Gulf. Were you able to find ways to apply these standards here? Is that where some of this learning has come from?
Well, I think the learning comes from all of the different repayments that we've done. So, and as I said, each of those has had to be negotiated separately. So some of them display all of the good things about the standards, and some of them we were less successful. And I think the hope is that we can use these standards to drive up the quality of repayments and to make sure that people don't fall into the same mistakes again and again and again. I mean, I would say that the more recent repayments, we have actually been able to hit minimum standard throughout, and in some cases at higher levels as well. And, let's think about what this can actually mean. This can mean repayments to workers of between, say, $1,000 and $5,500. And repayments to them personally and directly, which make a massive impact on their lives. So I think it's really worth investing the time and thought into doing this, because arguably it's probably the most direct impact that any of us will ever have on workers in supply chains when it comes to changing lives.
No, absolutely. And so often this sort of access to remedy, an effective remedy for workers is missing. And this is a very clear example where that remedy piece is actually enacted. Otherwise, it's so often the remedy piece for workers is the forgotten part of the UN Guiding Principles, of course. Rosey, what's next for the standards? Do you hope that they can become a key point of reference for companies and others committing to reimbursing recruitment fees? How do you see them? Where do you see them sitting? Where would you like them to sit?
Yeah, I mean, you're right, Neil, because a small private sector consultancy is a slightly odd home. We are not a standard setting body. And as I say, we did this in order to facilitate our own practice actually initially, but it's spiraled terrifyingly out of control, which is very, very good. And I'm hoping very much there'll become a movement actually for focus on repayment for the reasons that I've said. We're delighted actually that there's been a lot of leaning in towards the standards, because I think people realise that there's a gap in the current architecture on this, and something intensely practical like this is needed to fill the gap. The IOM are consulting internally on the standards over the next month or so, and we hope very much that they will adopt, adapt, change, whatever, but have something in their architecture that covers this sort of ground. We're also, we've heard from both Amphori and RBA that they are working again on these issues, consulting with us and others. And again, they're from the industry perspective, coming up with what works for them. We've had some very good engagement with trade union movement as well. Obviously who are keen on access to remedy and facilitating that, because I think one of the points that many people have made is you can get remedy now, but by the time it comes, it takes such a long time through all of the different judicial and other mechanisms, and it only applies to a very small number of people. Let's try and lift all boats. So over the coming months, and anyone listening to this who wants to volunteer, please do step forward. I think creating a movement or coalition towards making this the norm will be super important. And of course, we're talking, as I said, to lawmakers, to policymakers in government as well, because of course, there may be a role for these, for example, in the new registry for modern slavery statements, which is being planned at the moment. There are now discussions, aren't there, on required content, and it would be very interesting, for example, if repayment could become one of those things. So watch this space, Neil. I shall be on the phone to you, as you know.
I think it's very interesting, and it's not just the modern slavery legislation in the UK and Australia. Of course, as you mentioned at the start of the discussion, the withhold release orders that we're increasingly seeing deployed in the US as well. Rosey, I'm sure that people can find more details on the Impactt website, and I should point out to listeners that Impactt in this case is spelt with 2 T's at the end.
Thanks, Neil.
And we will make sure that it's also well signposted from the IHRB website as well. Rosey, thank you for your time today. This is a really important topic and a vital part of the debate about ending the practice of migrant workers paying recruitment fees. These standards provide the practical tools for reimbursement should that be needed. And what we of course do hope is that they also help challenge the assumption that it's okay for workers to ever pay recruitment fees in the first place. But Rosey, thank you for your time today. It's very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks, Lou.